All right. Welcome, everyone, to Netroots Nation 2023, our virtual session, The Courts Are Not Lost, a roadmap to fighting back. We'll give people a moment or two to trickle into the room. We're going to just have a little placeholder slide up for the meantime, and we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you all for being here. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. My name is Denise, and I am part of the Netroots Nation support team. I am virtually joining y'all from lovely San Francisco, California, which is why I'm in a sweater in the end of June. I'm really excited for this session and very grateful to our participants for joining us today for this very important conversation. I'm going to be here throughout the session to support y'all attendees and the panelists. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat and I can answer them for you there. If you have questions for the panel, please use the questions tab in the app to submit those. You can also vote questions that you like up, that you think are popular, similar to yours. Hopefully we'll get some pretty decent engagement and some popular questions coming up. Just a reminder, this is a virtual space, but please make sure you do abide by our community guidelines. And if you are in need of captions, whether you're on your mobile or your desktop, you should see a small box with the letters CC in it. You can click into that and choose the language that you are most comfortable with in order to enable captions for this session. We are being recorded and the session will be available in the app afterwards. And we also just want to remind you that we've opened our Netroots 2023 game. And if you would like to get on the leaderboard and earn some bragging rights, in addition to the chance to win a registration for next year, you're going to want to go to today's first challenge and enter the word voting. And I'll give everybody a quick reminder at the end. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panel. You won't see me on stage, but I will be here in the chat. So please don't hesitate to reach out with the tech or process questions. And again, thank you to our panel.
And thank you, Denise, so much. Welcome, everyone. And thanks to Denise for holding down the room and Netroots for moderating and accepting this panel, as well as numerous courts-related panels that we'll mention a little bit later to get you geared up for Chicago. And also thanks to each and every one of you who have joined us today or who are tuning in after the fact to catch up on the session. We're here today because access to abortion, gun safety protections, LGBTQ rights, affirmative action, student debt relief, workers' rights, and so much more. Every issue on the progressive agenda and literally the Netroots agenda hangs in the balance of our courts right now. As the ultraconservative Supreme Court comes to the end of its term this week, the stakes really couldn't be clearer. We are awaiting monumental decisions that could affect rights that we hold dear and precedents that we have relied on for decades. The conservative right is trying to replicate the very strategy behind overturning Roe v. Wade to wage an absolute assault on other rights and freedoms. But while these decisions are devastating and have undeniably grave consequences on our communities, there is still hope. And we're here today because real solutions exist that the progressive movement can advocate for to beat back against these decisions and protect our rights. So welcome to the panel. We're here to say the courts are not lost and provide a roadmap to fighting back. My name's Keith Tyrion. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Strategy at Alliance for Justice Action Campaign and our affiliate Alliance for Justice. For over 40 years, we've fought for courts that protect the rights of all of us and not just the wealthy and powerful. And as you've no doubt also seen, in recent years, we've seen a progressive awakening to the courts. The traditional notion that the right cares more is absolutely out the window. And in just the past few weeks, let alone the past year, we've seen why, as the court has issued multiple decisions decimating our rights. But these decisions are far from the final say in our rights. In the face of this grave threat, we must and we are rising to the moment that it demands. We must and we are use every lever of power and build our movements to transform the courts so they work for all of us, and use every lever of power to defend our rights when the courts have turned its back. Over the next hour, we'll discuss the real solutions to fight back against the harm coming from this Supreme Court. We'll talk about the importance of lower courts, the need for ethics and court reform, and how we can achieve it, the role of state policies and ballot initiatives in protecting our rights, and why, looking ahead, we absolutely must mobilize our communities in 2024. And through it all, we'll include the real lessons learned in the year after the Dobbs decision. The reproductive rights and justice movements have been meeting the moment head on in the year since Dobbs, and fighting and winning. We need you to be engaged in this fight with us, and together we can and we will make a difference. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to introduce my colleagues within this movement who are serving as panelists for today's discussion. First, we have Shwetika Baijal, Senior Director of Campaigns at Planned Parenthood Action Fund and Planned Parenthood Votes. She co-manages a team of 11 public affairs experts who support all elements of public affairs across all 50 states, and she runs multi-million-dollar Planned Parenthood Votes independent expenditure programs to help elect sexual and reproductive health champions across the country and up and down the ballot. She's also joining us and lives in Washington, D.C. Cedric Lawson is the field director at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. There, he guides a team of field managers that actively organize coalition members and local partners regarding the census, education equity, fighting hate and bias, and justice reform. Cedric has engaged in fair courts, judicial and executive branch nomination campaigns, and been a partner in crime in Supreme Court case mobilizations and campaigns for the past 9 years. Cedric is also a founding member of the Black Youth Project 100. Meg Simons has been in the fight for fair courts for over 7 years. Meg is currently the digital content manager for People for the American Way, and I have to note, a former member of the communications team at Alliance for Justice and AFJ Action. Meg has worked with coalition partners to lead the digital organizing efforts for 4 Supreme Court fights and dozens of lower court judicial nominations fight. You've no doubt seen her graphics, attended her past Netroots trainings, or otherwise seen the results of her innovative leadership in the digital space. Now, before we kick off, a reminder to everyone to submit questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A function, and we'll get to them at the end. Second, we want to recognize there are 4 different organizations represented here. So although we are aligned on many things and in our commitment to fighting for our rights and our courts, approaches may vary from one organization to another, and one position doesn't necessarily speak for all. We're here to explore the full range and let those 1,000 flowers of activism bloom while adhering to strategies that we know work. So to kick us off, I want to start out hearing from each of our panelists and frame the conversation that we're about to have. We know the Supreme Court touches nearly every aspect of our lives and the issues that all of us care about. Facing this extreme court, and in the thick of decisions coming down at the end of this term and this very week, could you each give us a brief introduction to how you came into this work and what it means for your organization? And I'll turn it to Cedric to start out.
Thank you, Keith, and I'm so happy to be here with colleagues with whom I've been doing this work for quite some time. And to speak to that, how I came into this work was through my organization at the Leadership Conference. I came to the Leadership Conference as an organizer who organized a number of different organizations within the Leadership Conference. The Leadership Conference is a coalition, an organization of organizations that includes 200 plus national organizations. I had come from U.S. Student Association, as well as People for the American Way through their Young People For program. And incoming to the Leadership Conference as a field associate, I had worked on voting rights and affirmative action. Not so coincidentally, those are still two issues where we see a number of Supreme Court cases, not just when I joined the Leadership Conference, but affirmative action still stays at the forefront. Voting rights and democracy, access to the democracy stays at the forefront of the Supreme Court and our lower courts. And it is because of those issues, as well as other issues, including but not limited to student loan repayment, economic security, reproductive rights, LGBT justice, many issues that I worked on prior to coming to the Leadership Conference. And during my tenure here, I saw a clear connection regarding not just advocating when it comes to the first and second branches of government, but also the third, the federal judiciary. And once I was able to understand how the issues that I worked on and organized around connected to the Supreme Court and to the federal judiciary broadly, it was through that understanding, doing the work, that I became a judicial advocate. I became a fair courts advocate. So that is work that I've done now for a number of years here, working on about 5 Supreme Court vacancy campaigns over the past few years. But of course, in addition to that, many lower court, the District Court and Circuit Court of Appeals nominations campaigns as well. Mobilizations at the court, whether it's for decision days or for oral arguments, which is what we saw earlier in this term last fall. So it has really been a joy to have a more fuller understanding of how our government works by taking part in these different campaigns, whether it's related to not only the judicial nominations and confirmations, but the cases that come before the court, how to activate and organize constituencies to work together when we understand that we have a common bond when it comes to how decisions are handed down by the Supreme Court. But then again, how all of this is interconnected, and understanding a really particular role that I have now with these incredible advocates that you see here, and many of whom we'll work with throughout the Netroots Nation Conference, how to democratize, demystify, and missing the last D here, democratize, demystify, and ensure at this point that we make sure that people are aware of how the third branch of government is important in all our lives. Thank you, Keith.
Excellent. Thanks, Cedric. Meg, why don't we hear from you next?
Absolutely. So I'm one of those weird people who's just been weirdly invested in the courts from like a very young age. And that's partly because of the way I've interacted with the courts in my personal life, right? My family had different issues. They had to go to court in my younger life. And I saw firsthand what the difference between a good judge and a bad judge meant for my family. And from then I remember sitting like under like moving chairs, listening to judges decide, you know, whether or not my uncle was going to get custody of his kids or a myriad of other things, right? As like a 5, 6, 7-year-old. And that really brought me into this work. And it's been getting good people on the bench who understand how these courts really impact us as people has been a huge focus of mine since then. And thankfully, I ended up in a place at Justice at Stake, which no longer exists, and then an Alliance for Justice, and now at People For, where I get to do that every day. And that's super cool. And I'm super excited to be here to talk to you about it. I'm currently with People for the American Way. We're a national progressive advocacy organization that inspires and mobilizes community and cultural leaders to advance truth, justice, and the American way. We convene courageous Americans, produce compelling media, and organize campaigns to defend our democracy from authoritarian threats and advance America's promise that everyone will enjoy freedom, safety, and a vote that counts. And the way the courts play into that for us is that we believe every single person deserves a justice system that works for all of us, not just the wealthy and powerful. And the best way we can do that is to make sure that we have judges who understand the way the laws impact people, the way our justice system impacts people, and are going to make sure that that we live up to the promise on the Supreme Court of equal justice for all of us. I'm done.
I'm happy to jump in. Hi, everyone. Shwetika, she, hers at Planned Parenthood. So this question is really interesting because I feel like it tracks my engagement with this issue. Before my job at Planned Parenthood, I did a stint as a political consultant in the Bay Area in California, where I helped organize a protest with NARAL against Kavanaugh's nomination in 2018, who at the time was the least popular nominee for the Supreme Court, and still somehow made it, because that's where we are today. And joining Planned Parenthood in February of 2020, 3 weeks before the world shut down, on the second week of my job, I was at a protest in front of the Supreme Court. And really, in my entire time with Planned Parenthood, the Supreme Court has played an oversized role in my work on the policy advocacy side and electoral side, particularly. When RBG passed in October of 2020, I got to see our organization have a plan that went into effect, a rapid response plan that went into effect. And you can really draw the line to where we are today from that moment, because the moment that happened and the super fast confirmation of the judges that came after, like, that's where we are today. And so for how I came into this work, it's kind of connected to the issue of reproductive rights and access. But one thing that I want to share is that it feels like an obvious one now, 1 year post Dobbs. But I like to tell people that, before the political leak, my job in spaces like this used to be to convince people that a threat even exists, that convince people that the Supreme Court could do what it's done. And to that, as a point of data, in October of 2021, we did a poll with our friends at Emily's List and NARAL, and among supporters of abortion rights, only 30% in October of 2021 believed that the Supreme Court could rule the way that it did in Dobbs, gutting abortion access. So this is to show that we are now in a different paradigm. And our job at Planned Parenthood, as a result, is to advocate for comprehensive reform alongside our other issue partners. And these attacks on our democratic rights, really abortion rights, even, all of these are about freedom and autonomy. But at the end of the day, it's also about trust, right? Like, it's about whether people trust us, people being legislators and leaders like the judges, trust us to make decisions about our own lives and our own bodies. And so whether or not we have systems that allow those freedoms to live on, live our most authentic lives, that's what the Supreme Court now has become. It's become another system. Many would argue it's always been a system of oppression, and that has to be transformed completely. And so Planned Parenthood on that end supports a number of policies to reform our federal courts. Those include expansion of the Supreme Court, term limits, ethics reforms, or if that doesn't happen, I feel like every one of us should be given our own billionaire for vacations. Like, I just feel like that's fair. As well as things like, an expanded federal judiciary and ending forum shopping. Additionally, I'm an electoral person. Like Keith said, I run the IE for Planned Parenthood. So from an electoral perspective, it is not hyperbole to say that every year Senate seats are up. It's about the Supreme Court. We've seen that with the runoffs in Georgia. We've seen that with, the last few years, and the presidential election, which is coming up as well. So I also think my last point here is we also have a long way to go to catch up to the other side on state Supreme Courts. But thankfully, this Dobbs decision has really activated and mobilized people on our side, that we have a path towards that. And I'm happy to dig into all of this in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Shweta and everyone. So while we know that the right has had a decades-long effort at capturing our courts, I want to start with just 1 year ago and what, unfortunately, those 70% in that poll were wrong about. Just 3 days ago was the 1-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision that overturned the constitutional right to an abortion. It's the first time a right has been stripped away, and the ruling, the rhetoric, and the activities since have signaled that this is absolutely just the start. But what has been incredibly impressive is the rapid response, the mobilization of reproductive rights and justice communities in response to Dobbs. Everything from on the ground, abortion funds, legal defense, state policies, ballot initiatives. Just with all of that, Shweta, can you share some of the lessons learned that you all have from the past year of not backing down, of saying, no, it's on?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest lesson learned is what I kind of already said, which is it has been a complete paradigm shift in the way the public perceives the power and role of the Supreme Court. My boss, Jenny Lawson, used to say, like, it's actually a product of hope, right? Most of us have been around when the Supreme Court has done good. So that 70% that you named, Keith, are people who just believed that good would continue, because it had for decades before that point. But that is not the paradigm we're in. And I think, the only reason that the decisions have been even remotely moderate coming out the last few days is because of how deeply unpopular they've become, both on their ruling on Dobbs and the whole stuff with the billionaires, right? Like, so I think one of the biggest lessons that we've learned and we are incorporating going forward is that people are on our side. Like, this issue, it is no need to make nuance, no need to get into policy. Supports abortion access, does not. Will do this, will not do this. It is really just distilling our advocacy or our discussion of candidates at every level to just that, and not overcomplicating it, given that for decades and certainly for the last few years leading up to this moment, that was our job. Our job was to try to get people to realize this was about to happen. People get it now. And I always say that one of my biggest regrets is not really seeing this paradigm shift and how it was going to happen in real time coming. So let me give you a very specific example. On the Action Fund NRIE side, in October 2021, same time as when we got those poll results, we made a strategic decision to not invest in C4 voter registration because we just didn't have capacity. We didn't know how it would go, blah, blah. And also all our previous research showed that it wasn't always like the most clear-cut thing, blah, blah. You all know, you all deal with polling. Fast forward to this time last year, and the word Roe was one of the most searched terms for about the whole of July. Now, if I could time travel and go back and tell myself that I was making the bad decision and I should have just set up search term ads with Roe connecting to a voter reg page, like, we would have probably held on to the house. I mean, I'm just saying. But that's my point. Like, it has been such a paradigm shift that even our own research from before before Roe fell to now is needing updates and needing to really get back on track with how visceral this issue is. And on that point, people just now get it. They get that abortion access is threatened. They get that it's being defined state by state. Sometimes just explaining to people in a state what the state of abortion access is for them is enough to mobilize them, right? Just explaining where they're at is enough to mobilize them. And for candidates running for state Supreme Court, for example, most recently in Wisconsin, we saw that. We saw that like there was no need to explain how the state Supreme Court impacts abortion. People got it, and abortion was absolutely the reason why that court in Wisconsin flipped. And that flip is going to have massive consequences for voting rights, for other issues in that state. So I think the biggest lesson is we're living in a new world, and we need to tap into the power of this issue for the good of other issues too.
Excellent. And I really want to pick up on that last part and that you started with, where one of the lessons learned is that people are on our side, to embrace what we know is right and embrace the justice that we are seeking. And I think across the board, when it comes to our courts, folks on the other side, the Leonard Leos, the others, have not shied away from who they want on the court, and that their goal is to enact the very policies that they know voters don't support and they couldn't get through the legislature. So as we think about this, what it means to ensure that vision for our courts that works for all of us, how does that lesson tie into the broader courts and judicial nominations work? And Cedric, looking to see if you want to kick us off on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's important for us is to know how we can engage people specifically on the courts on an issue that is so, using big words here, esoteric, arcane, but something that people, for so many reasons, shy away from and continue to tie it to the issues that they care about. Every issue that we can think of that someone is passionate about in the United States will come up to the federal courts. And moreover, in many cases, in most, it will start at the district court level. So we have an opportunity, considering that the district court is hearing cases every day related to issues that someone cares about, to make that immediate connection for the individuals whom we're looking to activate, the individuals whom we're looking to organize, and create teachable moments out of each of those cases that affect their daily lives. It's kind of a paradigm shift, but also it's something that we're balancing, which is that these court cases happen every day. However, at the same time, in terms of something that someone's passionate about, it may only come every now and then. But this is a way that we show that the courts have an effect on the everyday lives we live. And now, considering the truly sacred right to an abortion in this society is at risk broadly and is withheld in so many places in this country, we're fired up broadly. And in terms of the civil rights community, we have a very clear understanding, to Shwetika's point earlier, that there's an inherent tie between voting rights and reproductive rights, that understanding how democracy works and understanding how we have to protect our reproductive rights really builds that organizing and democratic muscle for individuals, democracy-based muscle, so that they have an understanding of how government has an impact on their lives broadly. So it is a really exciting and, of course, necessary moment where people are having a clear understanding of how government works across the board, to Keith's point, whether it's in terms of direct democracy through ballot measures, or through representative democracy, or through the courts, and understanding in what ways these different judicial nominees or candidates are selected, and what role everybody plays in the confirmation or election of those judges. But of course, on the federal level, when it comes to the confirmation of those judges.
Great, thanks for that. And zooming out a little bit, the reproductive rights movement is one good example in the overturning of Roe. But as we started out with, we've seen very concrete signals that this is a strategy that they are replicating to strip away additional rights. Literally, in the words of dissents or concurrences, of leaked opinions, and of the right strategies, chipping away at things like access to gender-affirming care. So before we go a deeper dive into some of the more specific strategies, Meg, can you talk a little bit about how we need to make sure that our fight back is as intersectional as their fight against us, and how that ties into playing offense when it comes to our courts?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some of us, this conversation about intersectionality is really familiar, right? It's one that we live in our daily, excuse me, that we live in our, I just get so choked up talking about the courts, that we live in our daily lives, right? As a queer person, as a AFAB person, assigned female at birth, non-binary person, as, you know, someone from the South who constantly sees the attacks on our voting rights make their way through the courts and all the way up to the courts. All of these cases are personal. And one of the things that the far right has definitely tried to do, and in some ways they've been successful, in some ways they haven't, right? But they know that their only chance of winning is to take our courts and divide us, right? By attacking us on kind of all of the fronts, all of the issues we care about, it makes it harder for us to respond because it feels like it's coming from everywhere, right? But that's the thing about the courts, and that's what makes caring about the courts, and that's what makes courts advocacy so powerful, is that all of these issues, all of these attacks come down to one place. They come down to the courts. So if we can make sure that we have the courts, and if we can bring together all these people who are saying, I'm afraid that, you know, my marriage license is from Texas. If Obergefell falls, I don't know what happens to my marriage license, right? I don't know what happens to my marriage. I don't know if I have to get married all over again. That's scary. I don't, thankfully I live in Maryland now, but I have family still who live in Texas and who are subject to these abortion rulings. One of the judge who made headlines about the medication abortion case, Matthew Kasmerick, sits in Plano, which is where I went to college, where I met my wife, where I grew up. These are all, when you talk about the courts, it can seem really abstract, right? It's these judges who we didn't vote for making these choices, but they're making these choices that have an impact on all of us. And if they can impact one of us on one thing, they can impact the rest of us on something else. And so it's important to remember that, like, we all live very intersectional lives and we are stronger together. And the only way we win is together and is by taking back our courts so we can do the things like pass legislation to protect abortion, pass legislation to protect our voting rights, and know that the Supreme Court isn't going to be like, nope. So that's why we have to be in this fight together. And that's why it's so important that we approach this with an intersectional lens and make sure we're bringing everyone into this movement.
I want to jump in there. First of all, Mike, I feel like you got me going on this afternoon. Like, that was so powerful. But I want to add a couple of things about how I personally think about all this. The first place I always like to tell people is, like, most people don't agree with legal theories of change. And that's a really hard thing for people like us to hear. But the fact of the matter is, this group of people and the people that we all work with who understand what Meg just laid out, that's actually a long line to draw for the average person. The individual experience of someone like Meg has to first find community. Then it has to find culture. Then it has to find power in media, in being able to be discussed as an accepted, like, experience. And then it becomes political, and then it becomes legislative and legal. So what I want to lift up is just, that's a long line to draw. And what I take heart in is, if they're just focused out here on the courts, they're not focusing on the other part of the line. And that's where the progressive side is winning. They are losing the rest of that work by investing only in the political and legislative. And don't get me wrong, they're creating a world of harm by doing that. Because they know for what they have, that's where their power to change I should say to protect their systems of oppression that uphold them sit. They know that that's where their resources are best invested. But also, the story I always like to tell is in California, in Southern California, the Republican Party is investing in community centers and Korean communities to do tax prep. So they're coming for that side of the line as well, right? Like, but I think our power really is the reason why we have to be intersectional, like Meg just said, is not just because it affects us individually in the beautiful way she laid out, but also it is where we have the most of our strengths is in building that line and then tipping our leaders over into the political and legislative. And on that piece, I think we have to hold our leaders accountable in a way that frankly I think we just don't. We think that we get them elected or we get them nominated and that's it. No, you got to keep an eye on their records and hold them to it. So that's one thing I want to add. And then the last thing I will say is, on this issue is that we also have to think about who is being harmed. This is like a multi-generational intentional record of harm on Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ people, immigrants, people with low incomes. We have to see the full picture of the harm. And if we can't just win up here with the courts, that doesn't mean we don't find ways to win in the other pieces of that line. Because I feel like a lot of times people think that when a court case is decided, that issue is done, and it is not done. It is not done because it has activated the rest of this line that in maybe not 5 years, but maybe 20 years, something bigger and bolder will take its place because we'll do the work up here.
Absolutely. And really want to reflect that line within the courts as well. That when the Supreme Court issues that decision, it's not actually the end-all, be-all, final say within the courts of that very issue. It's then up to hundreds of lower court judges to interpret it, to rule, to implement it, and that those very cases also impact all of our communities. And in some ways, given that there are about 7,000 cases that are asked to be reviewed by the Supreme Court every year, and they only take 100 to 150, it's those lower court judges that are that next line, either putting teeth into or aiming to restrict or figure out how these decisions actually play out to shape our lives. And Cedric, this is an issue that you've been active on for many years. For folks who may not be as familiar with the federal courts, can you explain a little bit more about how they're an important backstop and what it takes to engage on the federal courts at that level?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll quickly share from the constitutional perspective the role that courts play in our lives. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution makes clear that the president has the responsibility to nominate federal judges, and the Senate then advises and confirms those federal judicial nominees to serve in lifetime seats as federal judges. That is for the Supreme Court, as many of us, of course, see televised and closely watched during those fairly rare campaigns, although there have been quite a few in the last 10 years. That process happens for every federal judge. So not just the 9 Supreme Court members, 9 justices of the Supreme Court, 9 members of the Supreme Court, but then also the Circuit Court of Appeals judges, or the circuit court judges, of which there are 13 circuit courts across the country, and then the hundreds of district court judges around the country that serve on that more local level in our states. So with that said, we have to have that basic understanding of how those judges are selected, nominated, confirmed, and the nuance of what it takes to potentially thwart a judicial campaign. We know of some judges who their nominations have been rescinded by the White House, or they've been taken off the shelf, or judges have been voted down in committee or on the Senate floor. More for another time. But with that said, what it looks like for the federal courts to be a backstop for the issues that we care about, we have an opportunity to utilize the federal courts as a space to ensure that civil and human rights are respected. And whether that is through organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or other legal defense funds that will bring cases to the court. So, of course, the ACLU, these types of advocacy, legal advocacy organizations, plaintiffs who understand that their constitutional rights have been violated, have this opportunity to utilize the courts in a way to further expand our civil rights in this country. What we've seen, and I'll close on this, Keith, is our common opposition utilized the courts to roll back rights, to Shwetika's point, for the last 2 generations. Let's place a name on this. It's really been since Brown v. Board, which is one of the very few cases that people know just by the name or title of the case, right up there with Roe v. Wade, and sadly now with Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. It is because of that case that our opposition, understanding the expansion of the franchise here in the United States for Black communities, for communities of color broadly through Brown v. Board, that there has been a concerted effort over the last 2 generations to, through our common opposition, take over the court. A common opposition that would roll back civil rights. And we've seen this through reproductive rights. To Keith's point, we've seen it in concurrent opinions, namely from Justice Thomas, related to the 14th Amendment. We know at this point more now than ever what we're up against. So there is this deep opportunity that we have to continue to utilize the courts as a backstop, as a space where we know that we can hopefully depend on judges, federal judges that are committed to civil and human rights, that are committed to civil rights, and from that point, continue to uphold those civil rights in the face of an opposition at the Supreme Court level, but throughout the courts. It's not just on the state legislative and congressional level where we see a very clear delineation of 2 factions. We're also seeing that on the judicial level as well. And this is our opportunity to really utilize the courts as a space to fight back, because in many cases, the courts have been a backstop or the first line of defense in regards to what we care about. But sadly, what we're also seeing is in some cases, the court can be the last nail in the coffin in a lot of issues that we care about. So it's up to us to think through those strategies, and we look forward to sharing more here in this panel.
I love being on a panel with so many smart people because I'm going to reference both of y'all's responses real quick. But see Cedric's point about Brown v. Board, right? Like that was potentially the first time that the far right and forces that want to keep us divided in Brown v. Board very specifically, right? Looked and saw the power of what the court can do, right? It could say, oh, the court can decide one way and then decide a different way, right? And like they were like, oh, we need to end this. We need to take this for ourselves, right? But we can't forget that like the court does have the power to decide one way and then decide another way. And it's up to us to make sure that we are working to make sure that we are working with the culture, we're moving legislators, we're moving kind of the Overton window, right? To make sure that like we are saying like these are the things that are not okay. These are the things we're not going to stand for. And these are the rights that we demand be protected. And we can do that work. And then to Shwetika's point earlier, like I think sometimes people see these court decisions and see these decisions coming from both lower courts and the Supreme Court and say like, well, it's not like we can vote a judge out, right? There's nothing we can do about it. But the thing is like, your senators do work for you, right? And those senators, they're up for election every 2 years. or I mean, well, every 6, but there are some configuration of senators up for election every 2 years. And those senators, each senator votes on every single judge, or they should if they're doing their jobs, right? And so even if a judge isn't in your home state, they could be in your circuit. And even if not, your circuit could cite another circuit for precedent, right? So every single judge matters to you. And that means you get to have a voice, and you get to boop, 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 call your senator for every single one and be like, yes or no, right? And they're going to track those calls, and like they work for you at the end of the day. So like we do have a voice in this process, but we just have to remember to use it, because it can seem really far away from us. But we're seeing right now it's not. These judges that seem far away are making decisions every day that are impacting us directly. So I just couldn't pass up an opportunity to remind people to call their senators about judges. So I just wanted to hop in there.
Can I just jump on that? To your point, like we're people who still know this stuff. And I always tell the story. In the 2018 midterm, I was living in California. That's where my parents are from. And immigrant household, I'm the one who tells them what to vote for, like whatever. That's a different panel for a different time. But that year, the California ballot was like massive. It was a very thick ballot. And I was ashamed, underline ashamed, at when it came to that section of the judges. I knew nothing about any of them, even though my parents had been living in that town for like 8 years, living in just like that county for 12 plus, no, 50, whatever, long time. Those judges had been around for a long time. And it was only because in that moment I was living in that county, in there with them, living there with them, that I had to sit and spend at least 2 days researching all these judges, me who works in this space. And I found it so hard to find out that one of them actually supported Prop 8 and like kept getting reelected. And I, if I hadn't done that work on my own, I wouldn't be able to, bank 3 votes for that person's opponent, but also like communicate that to other political people I was working with at the time who lived there and being like, did you know about this? Right. So Meg, to your point, like, no, there's so much that to be done. To Cedric's earlier point, the lower courts are the path that all these people move up, that we have to catch them in. And we as a whole community, including people who work in this space like us, need to be better educated as a whole.
Excellent. And as someone who organized on Prop 8, thank you. So we spent some time talking about the decisions and the implications and how we can fight back from the avenue of protecting our rights. I want to shift a little bit to talking about the court itself and the backdrop for many of these decisions. As a court that rules on the most serious, consequential issues that touch every corner of our lives every day and the implications of that, we need to trust that these decisions are coming from sound jurisprudence, from an unquestionable integrity. And we've seen the opposite just in recent months, let alone going back years and years. Clarence Thomas has accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars of gifts, luxury yacht trips in recent years. Justice Alito, who was recently revealed, accepted a plane ride worth over $100,000, all without even disclosing and all without recusing themselves from the interest that these very friends, benefactors, had before the court. We clearly need some mechanism and to recognize that the Supreme Court are the only judges not held to a binding code of ethics. Meg, can you start us out talking a little bit more about why ethics reform is so intertwined with the issues and the rights that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So People Force President's name is Savante Myrick, and he loves to make the point. He was the mayor of Ithaca for a long time. And he loves to make the point that with the state legislators we work with, we know that like if they accept so much as like a sandwich, they have to report that. So the fact that the Supreme Court justices have been able to accept expensive private school tuition, sweetheart real estate deals, trips on super yachts and private jets without disclosing them or being held responsible in any meaningful way is absolutely mind-boggling. If you just look at this year, we've seen ethics scandals from 5 sitting Supreme Court justices. Justice Thomas and his super yachts, Justices Gorsuch and Barrett both had shady real estate deals. The revelation that the investigation into Brett Kavanaugh contained serious omissions. And now this news about Justice Alito and his fishing trips and his $1,000 bottles of wine. Our whole democracy depends on us all having confidence in our justice system. We deserve and need to know that the 9 people who get to make decisions about our rights, our laws, and our lives are held to the same ethical standards as every other judge on the federal bench. And right now, that's not the case. And it's not like we're asking for the moon here. The code of conduct that applies to lower court judges only has 5 canons. That a judge should uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary, that they should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety, that they should perform the duties of the office fairly, impartially, and diligently, that they can engage in extrajudicial activities as long as they're consistent with their office, and that they should refrain from political activity. Like, frankly, if you've worked at like a Starbucks, you've probably signed a more like binding code of conduct, right? Like, we're asking them to do their jobs and to do it without looking sketchy. Like, that's honestly all we're asking for. But they continue to refuse to apply this code of conduct to itself. And Justice Roberts can write all the letters he wants to the Senate Judiciary Committee, but until our justices stop taking money and rides on super yachts and free fishing trips from billionaires, how are any of us supposed to believe that justice isn't being bought and sold by the highest bidder? So we've already talked a lot about today about some of the things that have really kind of wrecked public trust in the courts. If the Supreme Court wants to start earning that trust back, they can start by holding themselves to the same enforceable code of conduct that we hold every single other judge to. It's that simple.
I can hop in and share a couple of things that I think Planned Parenthood also supports with court reform. Meg, everything you said is right. Or like I said, I'm okay with being assigned a billionaire who takes care of my wine and vacation needs. Like, I think that's just fair. So other things that we support, expanding the Supreme Court and putting term limits in place, to give more people who are younger, and by just that fact, more diverse, more diverse experiences, more diverse backgrounds, more diverse identities to serve on the court. The court was last expanded 150 years ago. So since then, yeah, the country looks very different. I'm not going to say anything about ethics reform. I think everything Meg just said is spot on. Then creating additional judgeships on lower courts to better distribute the work and to keep up with the growing population. And then preventing single judge divisions, which allows extreme interest groups to shop for judges like Kaczmarek, who will align their views. I mean, the entire concept of judge shopping is so absurd and a complete product of just how much this judiciary system is being used by the other side to oppress all of us. And I think growing the court in general is a really important way to not only reflect the United States as it now is, but also take politics out of the courtroom, which may be the hardest thing to do out of all of the things that I just said. That's, I think, what Planned Parenthood is completely in support of.
Yeah, I want to plus one a lot of those reform efforts. And I also want to say that, like, there is actually work happening right now on ethics reform that we can get excited about, right? I'm pulling up my list here because I want to shout out the senators who are actually putting forth bills to do this, but I think I might be in the wrong. Senators Murphy, Warren, Whitehouse, King, and Murkowski all have bills aimed at addressing judicial ethics and specifically Supreme Court ethics reform. And after the July 4th break, when the Senate gets back, they're actually going to vote in committee on Senator Whitehouse's Supreme Court ethics bill. So like there is work to be done on Supreme Court reform, and your senators need to be hearing from you right now. I told you I'm never going to pass up an opportunity to make you call your senators. But like, I know calling your senators is, nobody likes calling on the phone. Everyone hates using it as a phone. But like the Senate has not caught up to us just being able to casually text them yet. So like you have to just like, it'll take you 30 seconds. 202-224-3121. That is the Capitol switchboard. Get it tattooed on your forearm. That is the number you need to call your senators about. They'll connect you directly to them, and you can tell them, like, we have to fix this. Like, and it's their job to do it. Sorry for aggressively pointing at you all. I can't point at my senators, so unfortunately you're getting it. But we can do that right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Meg. I know we're running up short on time, and I know Shweta, you have to leave right at 3. So I want to turn one to the audience questions. And we have questions ranging from how do we convince issue-based orgs that this is the best way to move their cause forward when they're afraid of being political, in quotes, being political, to questions about building the pipeline of future nominees. For many of these, I also want to redirect you to the rest of the Netroots agenda, where there are multiple court sessions on everything from pipeline advocacy, Supreme Court term recaps, and more that will fill in. And right now, use this moment to focus on a question about keeping it up and keep on keeping on. With everything at the court being so important and urgent, how do we avoid burnout and tuning out and a dulling sense of energy and urgency to keep this fight up? And Shweta, I know we're going to lose you, so I'm going to turn to you to start.
That's such an emotional question. I feel like, first of all, this isn't the work of one generation. To Cedric's earlier point, right? Like, I think the biggest thing that what I call my master's education at Planned Parenthood, because I've now been here for 3 years when literally the world has changed, and I've seen how all the pieces of government have come together in our public structures have come together to take apart this right? So in my master's education at Planned Parenthood, the thing that I have most realized is that the world that we are fighting for today will not exist until maybe I'm not even in the work. And the world that I deserve today may not exist 2 generations from now, right? So it's such an emotional question to talk about. How do you keep going? I think the first thing is to recognize that just because you can't get to what the current imagination thinks is the broader win doesn't mean you stop. It just means you have to do your piece of it and then pass the whatever it's called, relay, in the relay race. And that's how it should be. It should be that someone will watch this in 10 years going, oh my God, they were so cute, thinking that they could just only do this, this, and this, right? Like, and that's how it should be. It should be that our ideas become outdated and other ideas and other priorities take over. And so I think just being really grounded in that you are not the end all and be all of this work is a very important thing, I think, for me. And then the other thing that I would add is, each of us individually has whatever form of internalized blank, racism, supremacy, blah, 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 like whatever it is that you may think, wherever you sit in the world, you have some version of that world's oppression internalized in you. And that work is, I think, almost for me as important, if not more important, for the longevity of the movement, because what's going on inside of us is a fractal of what is going on in the world. So I think as much as doing the work in our professional lives to move towards freedom is so important, doing work in our internal worlds, in our personal lives, in our relationships, in our minds is as important of a goal. And that's what I'll add.
Meg, Cedric, anything you want to add on this one?
I think Shweta did a great job. It is remembering that the way I think about it, right, is that when we think about history, we tend to think about the heroes, and we tend to think about just the heroes, right? But Martin Luther King Jr. did not organize the Civil Rights March by himself. There were hundreds of thousands of people who helped make that moment happen, who helped get the civil rights, who helped form the civil rights movement. And there were people who trained Martin Luther King Jr. And there were people who trained the people who trained Martin Luther King Jr. And like, this is, to Shwetika's point, this is a multi-generational fight. And like, we may not all be the heroes in the history book, but like, there are so many more of us that have to come together to make that happen, because nobody accomplishes anything alone. And so remembering who you're in the fight with is one of the things. Being here today with the people who I have spent many a late night conference room meeting with at 10 o'clock at night, trying to figure out how we're going to organize people around this Supreme Court justice fight or whatever, right? It is the people who you are in community with who matter and who will help you keep going when, or at least that's where I draw a lot of strength from, right? Is my community, is who is in this work with me, and knowing that like we are working together and that none of us are alone. So that's my maybe somewhat sappy answer.
I agree, of course, with everything that's been said. And within understanding where we all fit within the grander scheme of things, with also understanding the need for community, there also is a need to understand your power. So to understand what your power is, how you are able to contribute to your community, your communities, the campaigns and the issues that you care about, and to really harness that power, to put that in, as activist Audre Lorde has said, put it in the service of your vision for what you feel is a world that you want to see, and understand that through that trajectory of owning that power, knowing that, for example, that every senator votes on every judge, so you better do your darndest to hold your senators, if you have them, accountable related to the judicial nominees that they've chosen, or to hold your members of Congress related, hold them accountable related to judicial ethics reform. Understand what that power is. Is it a power to activate people, to educate people, to train people, to understand that power doesn't just come in the aforementioned? Power in many cases is seen as people power, money power, or voting power. Are you a good fundraiser? Are you someone who can activate people? Understand what your power is and utilize that power and harness that power, but then also conserve that power, and know that you can't do it all the time, all alone. We're working in community, which has been said. But when you really have that understanding of your power, what you bring to ensuring a self-determined life for you and others around you, it's from that point that you really can start to draw that map and to take part in this important franchise with so many other people, and to really, over the long term, or sometimes in the short term if we're lucky, see the fruits of your labor and understand what it means to be a part of a major campaign victory, and to live within that and utilize that as fuel to keep yourself empowered.
Thanks so much, both of you. And I'll add in, one of the, I think, best and worst days in this work was absolutely the day of the Kavanaugh confirmation. A Saturday when, despite every effort, turning out hundreds of thousands of people across the country, survivors sharing their stories, putting their bodies on the line, advocates from every corner and every walk of life, we knew we were going to lose that day. And yet, in front of the court, thousands of people crushed the court and said, this is not the end, this is our court. And from then, we have built on that momentum. And now we have Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to celebrate. And we have numerous nominees that we could not have seen without the building and the power building that even that loss brought us. So that is what we look ahead to. Even as we lose on some cases, we celebrate the victories and we continue fighting back. And so as you're seeing on your screen right now, there are specific ways that you can join this fight, speaking out about the importance of the court and all of our courts. If you're an individual, online, on your own accounts, if you're an organization, issuing statements, making those connections between the issues that drive your mission and the courts that are ruling on them. Also, tell your senators to confirm judges committed to equal justice, not just at the Supreme Court, but every judicial nominee they vote on. Call for structural changes. We can change the personnel, but we must also change the institution. Advocate for the state level policies that hold the line, that say, not in our state, we're not going backwards. And then looking ahead to next year, mobilize. Get your communities out there and understanding the importance of the courts in every issue that's coming up in 2024. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. We also want to draw your attention. We're going to be with you in Chicago. There are more courts going on at Netroots. There's a session on state courts are political, how to protect and transform our state judiciaries, led by AFJ Action Campaign. Shweta is also going to be on that panel again. Cedric and I will be running an advocacy training, Federal Judges 101, advocating for good judges from pipeline to confirmation. Our friends at the National Women's Law Center are leading a session, Our Rights, Our Court, recapping the 2022 to 2023 term. We don't even know the results yet, so it's going to be fresh analysis just a few weeks after these decisions are coming down. And then finally, our partners at People's Parity Project will be doing a session on expanding justice, organizing to reform the Supreme Court. Please check those out, join organizational tables in the town hall, reach out to us. Denise, if we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, there we are.
There we go. Finally, stay in touch with all of us. Here's the contact information for all of the panelists. Please reach out. We're happy to help you think through the details of how this fits into your work and what next steps are ready to take. So just one final thank you to the panelists, Meg, Cedric, Shweta. Thank you to Denise for holding down the back end and everything that Netroots does to pull off this conference. Really excited to keep up the conversation and looking forward to working with all of you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to all of our attendees, as mentioned. And thank you so much for the plug, Keith, for all of these other amazing sessions that are coming up. There were some great questions. And I think if you're attending in person, hopefully you'll be able to pop into some of those trainings and really get some in-depth answers to your questions. Again, we'll have this recording up for folks available in the next day or so. Don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. And for anybody playing the game, again, the clue for the first challenge is voting, VOTING. And just want to say thanks to everybody again. Hopefully we'll see you, if not later this afternoon, then again tomorrow.